Yes.
I'm just curious, can we assume that Dogen's followers would also know the same obscure koan that he's referencing, or at least would have access to them to potentially find them later on, or would they presumably be suffering under the same confusion as later translators?
Yeah, the question was, can we assume that Dogen's audience had the same sort of wealth of knowledge about the tradition? And I think we can assume it, yeah. You know, his Shobogenzo chapters are probably, whether he wrote them or whether they were his notes or whether someone else, you know, edited them later, but they were evidently talks he gave to his monastic community, and not in a large public gathering, but in a small gathering called Shosan, like a small gathering of him and his monks where he gives them instruction. So often, I think the Shobogenzo chapter that's left assumes that they've already been talking about some other text. Like, he's already prepared them. Like, I mean, it'd be as if, you know, in any college class, if you saw some lecture notes that the students, you know, what went on in the class, there's a lot assumed there. Like, what was the assigned reading? Okay? That's what they're talking about, but the student knows what it was, and that's not actually in the notes. Okay? So there's this sort of implicit knowledge of the topic. You know, but of course Dogen is modeling this kind of. The Japanese monks he was teaching were not so familiar with the Chinese Chan tradition, so he probably left some of them in the dark, you know, a lot of the time. But yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful stand-up. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. It was really interesting. And my question was, as you point out, the insight is already so wonderfully contained in the koan. For instance, the sentence, a question about whether or not the King of France has hair is only meaningful insofar as we know as France being a republic. And so my question is, since the koans are already so poignant, why does Dogen need to invert them? For instance, when he says, only a painted rice cake can truly satisfy hunger. Mm-hmm. He changes the original form of the koan. Why does he need to do that?
Right. The question is, why does Dogen need to say something else? The koans just seem to be complete in themselves, or you said so poignant. Why does he need to turn them around? Like only a painted, like Yunmen says, you know, obviously a painted rice cake, like a picture of a cake is not going to satisfy your hunger, right? But Dogen says only a painted rice cake satisfies. Okay. If you follow what I said about the doctrine of emptiness and doctrine of two truths, any statement, including Jiaozhou's famous Wu, is defective, right? And there's a dialectic here, because he said something. In fact, not only words, but in perhaps any attempt to signify something is defective. You know, there's a very famous story about the Vimalakirti and how he answers with silence, you see? But in the koan tradition, you'd say, Vimalakirti is a loudmouth, because his silence signifies something. As a matter of fact, his silence means the ultimate truth could not be said. Right? So he deserves a hit. Okay. So now Dogen he wants to turn that around. So he's doing exactly the same kind of thing. That you follow? I mean, you have to. Whoever is the judge now on an earlier case has to point out how that earlier case, because it's all cases and all language is on the level of conventional truth. So it's always wrong. It always needs to be judged wrong. And as soon as you say, no such thing, which is the ultimate judgment, you're wrong. And you're going to be judged. Because thing is, you know, you just contradicted yourself. You used the concepts. All right? So there's only conventional truth. Yes. And it's always wrong. Yeah.
I get concerned about, from that perspective, the inadvertent over-privileging of silence. And close to my mind, a line from one of Dogen's poems that goes something like, words express the truth, they do not exhaust the truth. I just wondered if you could comment on that in terms of, well, you know, what you are saying is, and as soon as we say something, it's on one, it's kind of wrong, but it's kind of not.
But also, there's nothing
It's
right. There's also nothing right unless we keep talking. I mean, that's what's very strange about this. It's not a question of just plain silence. Like dogs don't have very advanced language. They understand a few human words. So is that absence of, does that make them really profound Zen masters and Buddhas and everything? Yes. In order to understand, so ultimate truth, as I see it, is the understanding of the limitations of language. So unless you're talking, you can't understand the limitation of language and conceptual thought. So you need conceptual thought, and actually you need to follow it through to the nth degree, logically, to hit the limit. There's a limit to our understanding of the world. You don't hit that limit if you're just like dumb and don't think about it. Dogs do not hit the limit of language, right? So to hit the limit of language means using language and using it constantly. The Zen tradition in the Chinese Buddhist canon has by far the most massive amount of literature. And they're all saying the same thing. They're all saying, Santa Claus. Now, how many ways can you say Santa Claus? And you've got to keep telling the story over and over and over and over and over and over again. Keep talking, keep talking. Yeah.
I'm curious. I thought it was interesting about the digital search of the Chinese
Yeah.
canon for the quotes. I'm wondering, is there a concordance of Dogen that exists? I haven't seen one in English. Is there one in Japanese?
A concordance? I don't know.
Well, it's not exactly a concordance, but there's a famous professor, Kagamishima, who has, back in 1965, and then there was an update a couple of decades later,
Yeah.
they take master by master.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are books that try to identify the quotations that this is what Professor Hines is talking about. It's not exactly a concordance. But, all concordances nowadays are more or less useless with electronic search. Right? Yeah, question over there?
Yeah, koans, aren't they more of a direct pointing to something here and now? I was under the impression that when Umang was asked what is Buddha, he was leaving an outhouse.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ask me what is Buddha, I could say wood paneling with fern.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, isn't that something more direct and to the point?
Jingle bells. Yeah, maybe, but you know what? I smell a stinky whiff of attachment. Really, I mean, do you think it's just like saying what's ever there in front of you? If we say oak tree in the garden, an oak tree in the garden's in front of you right now. Right? You don't have to be there. That's too literalistic.